OSHA 1910.1024, Beryllium. 1910.1024, A. Scope and application. 1910.1024, A1. This standard applies to occupational exposure to beryllium in all forms, compounds, and mixtures in general industry, except those articles and materials exempted by paragraphs A2 and A3 of this standard. 1910.1024, A2. This standard does not apply to articles, as defined in the Hazard Communication Standard, HCS, Section 1910.1200, C, that contain beryllium and that the employer does not process. 1910.1024, A3. This standard does not apply to materials containing less than 0.1% beryllium by weight where the employer has objective data demonstrating that employee exposure to beryllium will remain below the action level as an 8-hour TWA under any foreseeable conditions. 1910.1024, B. Definitions. As used in this standard, action level means a concentration of airborne beryllium of 0.1 micrograms per cubic meter of air, μg/m3, calculated as an 8-hour time-weighted average, TWA. Airborne exposure and airborne exposure to beryllium mean the exposure to airborne beryllium that would occur if the employee were not using a respirator. Assistant Secretary means the Assistant Secretary of Labor for Occupational Safety and Health, United States Department of Labor, or designee. Beryllium lymphocyte proliferation test, BLPT, means the measurement of blood lymphocyte proliferation in a laboratory test when lymphocytes are challenged with a soluble beryllium salt. Beryllium sensitization means a response in the immune system of a specific individual who has been exposed to beryllium. There are no associated physical or clinical symptoms and no illness or disability with beryllium sensitization alone, but the response that occurs through beryllium sensitization can enable the immune system to recognize and react to beryllium. While not every beryllium sensitized person will develop chronic beryllium disease, CBD, beryllium sensitization is essential for development of CBD. Beryllium work area means any work area where materials that contain at least 0.1% beryllium by weight are processed either 1. During any of the operations listed in Appendix A of this standard, or 2. Where employees are, or can reasonably be expected to be, exposed to airborne beryllium at or above the action level. CBD Diagnostic Center means a medical diagnostic center that has a pulmonologist or pulmonary specialist on staff and on-site facilities to perform a clinical evaluation for the presence of chronic beryllium disease, CBD. The CBD Diagnostic Center must have the capacity to perform pulmonary function testing, as outlined by the American Thoracic Society criteria, bronchoalveolar lavage, BALE, and transbronchial biopsy. The CBD Diagnostic Center must also have the capacity to transfer BAL samples to a laboratory for appropriate diagnostic testing within 24 hours. The pulmonologist or pulmonary specialist must be able to interpret the biopsy pathology and the BAL diagnostic test results. Chronic beryllium disease, CBD, means a chronic granulomatous lung disease caused by inhalation of airborne beryllium by an individual who is beryllium sensitized. Confirmed positive means the person tested has had 2 abnormal BLPT test results, an abnormal and a borderline test result, or 3 borderline test results, obtained from tests conducted within a 3-year period. It also means the result of a more reliable and accurate test indicating a person has been identified as having beryllium sensitization. Contaminated with beryllium and beryllium contaminated mean contaminated with dust, fumes, mists, or solutions containing beryllium in concentrations greater than or equal to 0.1% by weight. Dermal contact with beryllium means skin exposure to 1. Soluble beryllium compounds containing beryllium in concentrations greater than or equal to 0.1% by weight. 2. Solutions containing beryllium in concentrations greater than or equal to 0.1% by weight. Or 3. Visible dust, fumes, or mists containing beryllium in concentrations greater than or equal to 0.1% by weight. The handling of beryllium materials in non-particulate solid form that are free from visible dust containing beryllium in concentrations greater than or equal to 0.1% by weight is not considered dermal contact under the standard. Director means the director of the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health, NIOSH, U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, or designee. Emergency means any occurrence such as, but not limited to, equipment failure, rupture of containers, or failure of control equipment, which may or does result in an uncontrolled and unintended release of airborne beryllium that presents a significant hazard. High-efficiency particulate air (HEPA) filter means a filter that is at least 99.97% efficient in removing particles 0.3 micrometers in diameter. Objective data means information, such as air monitoring data from industry-wide surveys or calculations based on the composition of a substance, demonstrating airborne exposure to beryllium associated with a particular product or material or a specific process, task, or activity. The data must reflect workplace conditions closely resembling or with a higher airborne exposure potential than the processes, types of material, control methods, work practices, and environmental conditions in the employer's current operations. Physician or other licensed healthcare professional, PLHCP, means an individual whose legally permitted scope of practice, i.e., license, registration, or certification, allows the individual to independently provide or be delegated the responsibility to provide some or all of the healthcare services required by paragraph K of this standard. Regulated area means an area, including temporary work areas where maintenance or non-routine tasks are performed, where an employee's airborne exposure exceeds, or can reasonably be expected to exceed, either the time-weighted average, TWA, permissible exposure limit, PL, or short-term exposure limit, SAL. This standard means this beryllium standard, 29 CFR 1910.1024. 1910.1024, C, permissible exposure limits, PLs, 1910.1024, C1, time-weighted average, TWA, PL. The employer must ensure that no employee is exposed to an airborne concentration of beryllium in excess of 0.2 μg/m3 calculated as an 8-hour TWA. 1910.1024, C2, short-term exposure limit, STL. The employer must ensure that no employee is exposed to an airborne concentration of beryllium in excess of 2.0 μg/m3 as determined over a sampling period of 15 minutes. 1910.1024, D, exposure assessment. 1910.1024, D1, general. The employer must assess the airborne exposure of each employee who is or may reasonably be expected to be exposed to airborne beryllium in accordance with either the performance option in paragraph D2 or the scheduled monitoring option in paragraph D3 of this standard. 1910.1024, D2, performance option. The employer must assess the 8-hour TWA exposure and the 15-minute short-term exposure for each employee on the basis of any combination of air monitoring data and objective data sufficient to accurately characterize airborne exposure to beryllium. 1910.1024, D3, scheduled monitoring option. 1910.1024, D3, I, through 1910.1024, D3, 8, the employer must perform initial monitoring to assess the 8-hour TWA exposure for each employee on the basis of one or more personal breathing zone air samples that reflect the airborne exposure of employees on each shift, for each job classification, and in each work area. The employer must perform initial monitoring to assess the short-term exposure from 15-minute personal breathing zone air samples measured in operations that are likely to produce airborne exposure above the SAL for each work shift, for each job classification, and in each work area. Where several employees perform the same tasks on the same shift and in the same work area, the employer may sample a representative fraction of these employees in order to meet the requirements of this paragraph, D3. In representative sampling, the employer must sample the employees expected to have the highest airborne exposure to beryllium. If initial monitoring indicates that airborne exposure is below the action level and at or below the SAL, the employer may discontinue monitoring for those employees whose airborne exposure is represented by such monitoring. Where the most recent exposure monitoring indicates that airborne exposure is at or above the action level but at or below the TWAPL, the employer must repeat such monitoring within 6 months of the most recent monitoring. Where the most recent exposure monitoring indicates that airborne exposure is above the TWAPL, the employer must repeat such monitoring within 3 months of the most recent 8-hour TWA exposure monitoring. Where the most recent, non-initial, exposure monitoring indicates that airborne exposure is below the action level, the employer must repeat such monitoring within 6 months of the most recent monitoring until 2 consecutive measurements, taken 7 or more days apart, are below the action level, at which time the employer may discontinue 8-hour TWA exposure monitoring for those employees whose exposure is represented by such monitoring, except as otherwise provided in paragraph D4 of this standard. Where the most recent exposure monitoring indicates that airborne exposure is above the SAL, the employer must repeat such monitoring within 3 months of the most recent short-term exposure monitoring until 2 consecutive measurements, taken 7 or more days apart, are below the SAL, at which time the employer may discontinue short-term exposure monitoring for those employees whose exposure is represented by such monitoring, except as otherwise provided in paragraph D4 of this standard. 1910.1024 D4 Reassessment of exposure. The employer must reassess airborne exposure whenever a change in the production, process, control equipment, personnel, or work practices may reasonably be expected to result in new or additional airborne exposure at or above the action level or SAL, or when the employer has any reason to believe that new or additional airborne exposure at or above the action level or SAL has occurred. 1910.1024 D5 Methods of sample analysis. The employer must ensure that all air monitoring samples used to satisfy the monitoring requirements of paragraph D of this standard are evaluated by a laboratory that can measure beryllium to an accuracy of plus or minus 25% within a statistical confidence level of 95% for airborne concentrations at or above the action level. 1910.1024 D6 Employee notification of assessment results. 1910.1024 D6 I. Within 15 working days after completing an exposure assessment in accordance with paragraph D of this standard, the employer must notify each employee whose airborne exposure is represented by the assessment of the results of that assessment individually in writing or post the results in an appropriate location that is accessible to each of these employees. 1910.1024 D6 2. Whenever an exposure assessment indicates that airborne exposure is above the TWAPL or SAL, the employer must describe in the written notification the corrective action being taken to reduce airborne exposure to or below the exposure limits exceeded where feasible corrective action exists but had not been implemented when the monitoring was conducted. 1910.1024 D7 Observation of monitoring. 1910.1024 D7 I through 1910.1024 D7 3. The employer must provide an opportunity to observe any exposure monitoring required by this standard to each employee whose airborne exposure is measured or represented by the monitoring and each employee's representatives. When observation of monitoring requires entry into an area where the use of personal protective clothing or equipment, which may include respirators, is required, the employer must provide each observer with appropriate personal protective clothing and equipment at no cost to the observer and must ensure that each observer uses such clothing and equipment. The employer must ensure that each observer follows all other applicable safety and health procedures. 1910.1024 E. Beryllium work areas and regulated areas. 1910.1024 E1 Establishment. 1910.1024 E1 I through 1910.1024 E1 2. The employer must establish and maintain a beryllium work area wherever the criteria for a beryllium work area set forth in paragraph B of this standard are met. The employer must establish and maintain a regulated area wherever employees are, or can reasonably be expected to be, exposed to airborne beryllium at levels above the TWAPL or SAL. 1910.1024 E2 Demarcation. 1910.1024 E2 I through 1910.1024 E2 2. The employer must identify each beryllium work area through signs or any other methods that adequately establish and inform each employee of the boundaries of each beryllium work area. The employer must identify each regulated area in accordance with paragraph M2 of this standard. 1910.1024 E3 Access. The employer must limit access to regulated areas to 1910.1024 E3 I through 1910.1024 E3 3 persons the employer authorizes or requires to be in a regulated area to perform work duties, persons entering a regulated area as designated representatives of employees for the purpose of exercising the right to observe exposure monitoring procedures under paragraph D7 of this standard, and persons authorized by law to be in a regulated area. 1910.1024 E4 Provision of personal protective clothing and equipment, including respirators. The employer must provide and ensure that each employee entering a regulated area uses 1910.1024 E4 I through 1910.1024 E4 2 respiratory protection in accordance with paragraph G of this standard, and personal protective clothing and equipment in accordance with paragraph H of this standard. 1910.1024 F Methods of compliance. 1910.1024 F1 Written Exposure Control Plan. 1910.1024 F1 I The employer must establish, implement, and maintain a written exposure control plan, which must contain 1910.1024 F1 I A through 1910.1024 F1 I H a list of operations and job titles reasonably expected to involve airborne exposure to or dermal contact with beryllium. A list of operations and job titles reasonably expected to involve airborne exposure at or above the action level. A list of operations and job titles reasonably expected to involve airborne exposure above the TWAPL or SAL. Procedures for minimizing cross-contamination, including the transfer of beryllium between surfaces, equipment, clothing, materials, and articles within beryllium work areas. Procedures for keeping surfaces as free as practicable of beryllium. Procedures for minimizing the migration of beryllium from beryllium work areas to other locations within or outside the workplace. A list of engineering controls, work practices, and respiratory protection required by paragraph F2 of this standard. A list of personal protective clothing and equipment required by paragraph H of this standard. And 1910.1024 F1 I Procedures for removing, laundering, storing, cleaning, repairing, and disposing of beryllium-contaminated personal protective clothing and equipment, including respirators. 1910.1024 F1 2 The employer must review and evaluate the effectiveness of each written exposure control plan at least annually and update it, as necessary, when 1910.1024 F1 2A through 1910.1024 F1 2C any change in production processes, materials, equipment, personnel, work practices, or control methods results, or can reasonably be expected to result, in new or additional airborne exposure to beryllium. The employer is notified that an employee is eligible for medical removal in accordance with paragraph L1 of this standard, referred for evaluation at a CBD diagnostic center, or shows signs or symptoms associated with exposure to beryllium, or the employer has any reason to believe that new or additional airborne exposure is occurring or will occur. 1910.1024 F1 3 The employer must make a copy of the written exposure control plan accessible to each employee who is, or can reasonably be expected to be, exposed to airborne beryllium in accordance with OSHA's Access to Employee Exposure and Medical Records, Records Access, Standard, Section 1910.1020 E. 1910.1024 F2 I The employer must use engineering and work practice controls to reduce and maintain employee airborne exposure to beryllium to or below the PL and SAL, unless the employer can demonstrate that such controls are not feasible. Wherever the employer demonstrates that it is not feasible to reduce airborne exposure to or below the PLs with engineering and work practice controls, the employer must implement and maintain engineering and work practice controls to reduce airborne exposure to the lowest levels feasible and supplement these controls using respiratory protection in accordance with paragraph G of this standard. 1910.1024 F2 2 For each operation in a beryllium work area that releases airborne beryllium, the employer must ensure that at least one of the following is in place to reduce airborne exposure. 1910.1024 F2 2A through 1910.1024 F2 2D Material and or process substitution. Isolation, such as ventilated partial or full enclosures. Local exhaust ventilation, such as at the points of operation, material handling, and transfer. Or process control, such as wet methods and automation. 1910.1024 F2 3 An employer is exempt from using the controls listed in paragraph F2 2 of this standard to the extent that 1910.1024 F2 3a, the employer can establish that such controls are not feasible, or 1910.1024 F2 3b, the employer can demonstrate that airborne exposure is below the action level using no fewer than 2 representative personal breathing zone samples taken at least 7 days apart for each affected operation. 1910.1024 F3, prohibition of rotation. The employer must not rotate employees to different jobs to achieve compliance with the PLs. 1910.1024 G, respiratory protection. 1910.1024 G1, general. The employer must provide respiratory protection at no cost to the employee and ensure that each employee uses respiratory protection. 1910.1024 G1 I through 1910.1024 G1 the, during periods necessary to install or implement feasible engineering and work practice controls where airborne exposure exceeds, or can reasonably be expected to exceed, the TWAPL or SAL. During operations, including maintenance and repair activities and non-routine tasks, when engineering and work practice controls are not feasible and airborne exposure exceeds, or can reasonably be expected to exceed, the TWAPL or SAL. During operations for which an employer has implemented all feasible engineering and work practice controls when such controls are not sufficient to reduce airborne exposure to or below the TWAPL or SAL. During emergencies, and when an employee who is eligible for medical removal under paragraph L1 chooses to remain in a job with airborne exposure at or above the action level, as permitted by paragraph L2(2) of this standard. 1910.1024 G2, respiratory protection program. Where this standard requires an employer to provide respiratory protection, the selection and use of such respiratory protection must be in accordance with the Respiratory Protection Standard, section 1910.134. 1910.1024 G3, the employer must provide at no cost to the employee a powered air purifying respirator, PAPR, instead of a negative pressure respirator when 1910.1024 G3 I through 1910.1024 G3 respiratory protection is required by this standard. An employee entitled to such respiratory protection requests a PAPR, and the PAPR provides adequate protection to the employee in accordance with paragraph G2 of this standard. 1910.1024 H, personal protective clothing and equipment. 1910.1024 H1, provision and use. The employer must provide at no cost and ensure that each employee uses appropriate personal protective clothing and equipment in accordance with the written exposure control plan required under paragraph F1 of this standard and OSHA's personal protective equipment standards, subpart I of this part. 1910.1024 H1 I, where airborne exposure exceeds, or can reasonably be expected to exceed, the TWAPL or SAL, or 1910.1024 H1-2, where there is a reasonable expectation of dermal contact with beryllium. 1910.1024 H2, removal and storage. 1910.1024 H2I through 1910.1024 H2V. The employer must ensure that each employee removes all beryllium-contaminated personal protective clothing and equipment at the end of the work shift, at the completion of all tasks involving beryllium, or when personal protective clothing or equipment becomes visibly contaminated with beryllium, whichever comes first. The employer must ensure that each employee removes beryllium-contaminated personal protective clothing and equipment as specified in the written exposure control plan required by paragraph F1 of this standard. The employer must ensure that each employee stores and keeps beryllium-contaminated personal protective clothing and equipment separate from street clothing and that storage facilities prevent cross-contamination as specified in the written exposure control plan required by paragraph F1 of this standard. The employer must ensure that no employee removes beryllium-contaminated personal protective clothing or equipment from the workplace, except for employees authorized to do so for the purposes of laundering, cleaning, maintaining, or disposing of beryllium-contaminated personal protective clothing and equipment at an appropriate location or facility away from the workplace. When personal protective clothing or equipment required by this standard is removed from the workplace for laundering, cleaning, maintenance, or disposal, the employer must ensure that personal protective clothing and equipment are stored and transported in sealed bags or other closed containers that are impermeable and are labeled in accordance with paragraph M3 of this standard and the HCS, section 1910.1200. 1910.1024, H3, cleaning and replacement. 1910.1024, H3, I. The employer must ensure that all reusable personal protective clothing and equipment required by this standard is cleaned, laundered, repaired, and replaced as needed to maintain its effectiveness. 1910.1024, H3, 2. The employer must ensure that beryllium is not removed from beryllium-contaminated personal protective clothing and equipment by blowing, shaking, or any other means that disperses beryllium into the air. 1910.1024, H3, 3. The employer must inform in writing the persons or the business entities who launder, clean, or repair the personal protective clothing or equipment required by this standard of the potentially harmful effects of exposure to beryllium and that the personal protective clothing and equipment must be handled in accordance with this standard. 1910.1024, I. Hygiene areas and practices. 1910.1024, I1, General. For each employee working in a beryllium work area or who can reasonably be expected to have dermal contact with beryllium, the employer must, 1910.1024, I provide readily accessible washing facilities in accordance with this standard and the sanitation standard, section 1910.141, to remove beryllium from the hands, face, and neck, and 1910.1024, I-2, ensure that employees who have dermal contact with beryllium wash any exposed skin at the end of the activity, process, or work shift and prior to eating, drinking, smoking, chewing tobacco or gum, applying cosmetics, or using the toilet. 1910.1024, I-2, change rooms. In addition to the requirements of paragraph I-1I of this standard, the employer must provide employees who are required to use personal protective clothing or equipment under paragraph H-1-2 of this standard with a designated change room in accordance with this standard and the sanitation standard, section 1910.141, where employees are required to remove their personal clothing. 1910.1024, I-3, showers. 1910.1024, I-3, the employer must provide showers in accordance with the sanitation standard, section 1910.141, where 1910.1024, I-3, airborne exposure exceeds, or can reasonably be expected to exceed, the TWAPL or SAL, and 1910.1024, I-3, employees' hair or body parts other than hands, face, and neck can reasonably be expected to become contaminated with beryllium. 1910.1024, I-3, employers required to provide showers under paragraph I-3 of this standard must ensure that each employee showers at the end of the work shift or work activity if 1910.1024, I-3, the employee reasonably could have had airborne exposure above the TWAPL or SAL, and 1910.1024, I-3, the employee's hair or body parts other than hands, face, and neck could reasonably have become contaminated with beryllium. 1910.1024, I-4, eating and drinking areas. Wherever the employer allows employees to consume food or beverages at a worksite where beryllium is present, the employer must ensure that 1910.1024, I-4, through 1910.1024, I-4, 3, beryllium-contaminated surfaces in eating and drinking areas are as free as practicable of beryllium. No employees enter any eating or drinking area with beryllium-contaminated personal protective clothing or equipment unless, prior to entry, it is cleaned, as necessary, to be as free as practicable of beryllium by methods that do not disperse beryllium into the air or onto an employee's body, and eating and drinking facilities provided by the employer are in accordance with the sanitation standard, section 1910.141. 1910.1024, I-5, prohibited activities. The employer must ensure that no employees eat, drink, smoke, chew tobacco or gum, or apply cosmetics in regulated areas. 1910.1024, J, housekeeping. 1910.1024 J1 General. 1910.1024 J1 I. The employer must maintain all surfaces in beryllium work areas and regulated areas as free as practicable of beryllium and in accordance with the written exposure control plan required under paragraph F1 and the cleaning methods required under paragraph J2 of this standard. And 1910.1024 J1 2. The employer must ensure that all spills and emergency releases of beryllium are cleaned up promptly and in accordance with the written exposure control plan required under paragraph F1 and the cleaning methods required under paragraph J2 of this standard. 1910.1024 J2 Cleaning methods. 1910.1024 J2 I through 1910.1024 J2 The employer must ensure that surfaces in beryllium work areas and regulated areas are cleaned by HEPA-filtered vacuuming or other methods that minimize the likelihood and level of airborne exposure. The employer must not allow dry sweeping or brushing for cleaning surfaces in beryllium work areas or regulated areas unless HEPA-filtered vacuuming or other methods that minimize the likelihood and level of airborne exposure are not safe or effective. The employer must not allow the use of compressed air for cleaning beryllium-contaminated surfaces unless the compressed air is used in conjunction with a ventilation system designed to capture the particulates made airborne by the use of compressed air. Where employees use dry sweeping, brushing, or compressed air to clean beryllium-contaminated surfaces, the employer must provide and ensure that each employee uses respiratory protection and personal protective clothing and equipment in accordance with paragraphs G and H of this standard. The employer must ensure that cleaning equipment is handled and maintained in a manner that minimizes the likelihood and level of airborne exposure and the re-entrainment of airborne beryllium in the workplace. 1910.1024 J3 Disposal, Recycling, and Reuse. 1910.1024 J3 I through 1910.1024 J3 3 Except for intraplant transfers, when the employer transfers materials that contain at least 0.1% beryllium by weight or are contaminated with beryllium for disposal, recycling, or reuse, the employer must label the materials in accordance with paragraph M3 of this standard. Except for intraplant transfers, materials designated for disposal that contain at least 0.1% beryllium by weight or are contaminated with beryllium must be cleaned to be as free as practicable of beryllium or placed in enclosures that prevent the release of beryllium-containing particulate or solutions under normal conditions of use, storage, or transport, such as bags or containers. And except for intraplant transfers, materials designated for recycling or reuse that contain at least 0.1% beryllium by weight or are contaminated with beryllium must be cleaned to be as free as practicable of beryllium or placed in enclosures that prevent the release of beryllium-containing particulate or solutions under normal conditions of use, storage, or transport, such as bags or containers. 1910.1024 K1 General. 1910.1024 K1 I. The employer must make medical surveillance required by this paragraph available at no cost to the employee, and at a reasonable time and place, to each employee. 1910.1024 K1 A through 1910.1024 K1 I D. Who is or is reasonably expected to be exposed at or above the action level for more than 30 days per year, who shows signs or symptoms of CBD or other beryllium-related health effects, who is exposed to beryllium during an emergency, or whose most recent written medical opinion required by paragraph K6 or K7 of this standard recommends periodic medical surveillance. 1910.1024 K1 2. The employer must ensure that all medical examinations and procedures required by this standard are performed by or under the direction of a licensed physician. 1910.1024 K2 Frequency. The employer must provide a medical examination. 1910.1024 K2 I within 30 days after determining that 1910.1024 K2 I A an employee meets the criteria of paragraph K1 I A unless the employee has received a medical examination provided in accordance with this standard within the last 2 years, or 1910.1024 K2 IB an employee meets the criteria of paragraph K1 IB of this standard. 1910.1024, K2, at least every 2 years thereafter for each employee who continues to meet the criteria of paragraph K1, I, A, B, or D of this standard. 1910.1024, K2, 3, at the termination of employment for each employee who meets any of the criteria of paragraph K1, I, of this standard at the time the employee's employment terminates, unless an examination has been provided in accordance with this standard during the 6 months prior to the date of termination. Each employee who meets the criteria of paragraph K1, I, C of this standard and who has not received an examination since exposure to beryllium during the emergency must be provided an examination at the time the employee's employment terminates. 1910.1024, K2, 4, for an employee who meets the criteria of paragraph K1, I, C of this standard. 1910.1024, K2, 4, A, if that employee has not received a medical examination within the previous 2 years pursuant to paragraph K1, I of this standard, then within 30 days after the employee meets the criteria of paragraph K1, I, C of this standard, or 1910.1024, K2, 4, B, if that employee has received a medical examination within the previous 2 years pursuant to paragraph K1, I of this standard, then at least 1 year but no more than 2 years after the employee meets the criteria of paragraph K1, I, C of this standard. 1910.1024, K3, contents of examination. 1910.1024, K3, I, the employer must ensure that the PLHCP conducting the examination advises the employee of the risks and benefits of participating in the medical surveillance program and the employee's right to opt out of any or all parts of the medical examination. 1910.1024, K3, 2, the employer must ensure that the employee is offered a medical examination that includes 1910.1024, K3, 2A, through 1910.1024, K3, 2G, a medical and work history, with emphasis on past and present airborne exposure to or dermal contact with beryllium, smoking history, and any history of respiratory system dysfunction. A physical examination with emphasis on the respiratory system. A physical examination for skin rashes, pulmonary function tests, performed in accordance with the guidelines established by the American Thoracic Society, including forced vital capacity, FVC, and forced expiratory volume in 1 second, FEV1. A standardized BLPT or equivalent test, upon the first examination and at least every 2 years thereafter, unless the employee is confirmed positive. If the results of the BLPT are other than normal, a follow-up BLPT must be offered within 30 days, unless the employee has been confirmed positive. Samples must be analyzed in a laboratory certified under the College of American Pathologists/Clinical Laboratory Improvement Amendments, CLIA, guidelines to perform the BLPT. A low-dose computed tomography (LDCT) scan, when recommended by the PLHCP after considering the employee's history of exposure to beryllium along with other risk factors such as smoking history, family medical history, sex, age, and presence of existing lung disease, and any other test deemed appropriate by the PLHCP. 1910.1024, K4, information provided to the PLHCP. The employer must ensure that the examining PLHCP and the agreed-upon CBD Diagnostic Center, if an evaluation is required under paragraph K7 of this standard, has a copy of this standard and must provide the following information, if known. 1910.1024, K4, I, through 1910.1024, K4, 4, a description of the employee's former and current duties that relate to the employee's airborne exposure to and dermal contact with beryllium. The employee's former and current levels of airborne exposure. A description of any personal protective clothing and equipment, including respirators, used by the employee, including when and for how long the employee has used that personal protective clothing and equipment, and information from records of employment-related medical examinations previously provided to the employee, currently within the control of the employer, after obtaining written consent from the employee. 1910.1024, K5, licensed physician's written medical report for the employee. The employer must ensure that the employee receives a written medical report from the licensed physician within 45 days of the examination, including any follow-up BLPT required under paragraph K3(2)(e) of this standard, and that the PLHCP explains the results of the examination to the employee. The written medical report must contain 1910.1024 K5I, a statement indicating the results of the medical examination, including the licensed physician's opinion as to whether the employee has 1910.1024 K5IA, any detected medical condition, such as CBD or beryllium sensitization, i.e., the employee is confirmed positive, as defined in paragraph B of this standard, that may place the employee at increased risk from further airborne exposure, and 1910.1024 K5IB, any medical conditions related to airborne exposure that require further evaluation or treatment. 1910.1024 K5.2, any recommendations on 1910.1024 K5.2a, the employee's use of respirators, protective clothing, or equipment, or 1910.1024 K5.2b, limitations on the employee's airborne exposure to beryllium. 1910.1024 K5.3 through 1910.1024 K5v, if the employee is confirmed positive or diagnosed with CBD, or if the licensed physician otherwise deems it appropriate, the written report must also contain a referral for an evaluation at a CBD diagnostic center. If the employee is confirmed positive or diagnosed with CBD, the written report must also contain a recommendation for continued periodic medical surveillance. If the employee is confirmed positive or diagnosed with CBD, the written report must also contain a recommendation for medical removal from airborne exposure to beryllium, as described in paragraph L of this standard. 1910.1024 K6, licensed physician's written medical opinion for the employer. 1910.1024 K6I, the employer must obtain a written medical opinion from the licensed physician within 45 days of the medical examination, including any follow-up BLPT required under paragraph K3.2e of this standard. The written medical opinion must contain only the following: 1910.1024 K6IA through 1910.1024 K6ID, the date of the examination, a statement that the examination has met the requirements of this standard, any recommended limitations on the employee's use of respirators, protective clothing, or equipment, and a statement that the PLHCP has explained the results of the medical examination to the employee, including any tests conducted, any medical conditions related to airborne exposure that require further evaluation or treatment, and any special provisions for use of personal protective clothing or equipment. 1910.1024 K6.2 through 1910.1024 K6.6. If the employee provides written authorization, the written opinion must also contain any recommended limitations on the employee's airborne exposure to beryllium. If the employee is confirmed positive or diagnosed with CBD, or if the licensed physician otherwise deems it appropriate, and the employee provides written authorization, the written opinion must also contain a referral for an evaluation at a CBD diagnostic center. If the employee is confirmed positive or diagnosed with CBD and the employee provides written authorization, the written opinion must also contain a recommendation for continued periodic medical surveillance. If the employee is confirmed positive or diagnosed with CBD and the employee provides written authorization, the written opinion must also contain a recommendation for medical removal from airborne exposure to beryllium, as described in paragraph L of this standard. The employer must ensure that each employee receives a copy of the written medical opinion described in paragraph K6 of this standard within 45 days of any medical examination, including any follow-up BLPT required under paragraph K3.2e of this standard, performed for that employee. 1910.1024 K7, CBD Diagnostic Center. 1910.1024 K7I, the employer must provide an evaluation at no cost to the employee at a CBD diagnostic center that is mutually agreed upon by the employer and the employee. The evaluation at the CBD diagnostic center must be scheduled within 30 days, and must occur within a reasonable time of 1910.1024 K7IA, the employer's receipt of a physician's written medical opinion to the employer that recommends referral to a CBD diagnostic center, or 1910.1024 K7IB, the employee presenting to the employer a physician's written medical report indicating that the employee has been confirmed positive or diagnosed with CBD, or recommending referral to a CBD diagnostic center. 1910.1024 K7 2 through 1910.1024 K7 6. The employer must ensure that, as part of the evaluation, the employee is offered any tests deemed appropriate by the examining physician at the CBD diagnostic center, such as pulmonary function testing, as outlined by the American Thoracic Society criteria, bronchoalveolar lavage, Bale, and transbronchial biopsy. If any of the tests deemed appropriate by the examining physician are not available at the CBD diagnostic center, they may be performed at another location that is mutually agreed upon by the employer and the employee. The employer must ensure that the employee receives a written medical report from the CBD diagnostic center that contains all the information required in paragraph K5, I, 2, 4, and V of this standard, and that the PLHCP explains the results of the examination to the employee within 30 days of the examination. The employer must obtain a written medical opinion from the CBD diagnostic center within 30 days of the medical examination. The written medical opinion must contain only the information in paragraph K6, I, as applicable, unless the employee provides written authorization to release additional information. If the employee provides written authorization, the written opinion must also contain the information from paragraphs K6, 2, 4, and V, if applicable. The employer must ensure that each employee receives a copy of the written medical opinion from the CBD diagnostic center described in paragraph K7 of this standard within 30 days of any medical examination performed for that employee. After an employee has received the initial clinical evaluation at a CBD diagnostic center described in paragraphs K7I and 2 of this standard, the employee may choose to have any subsequent medical examinations for which the employee is eligible under paragraph K of this standard performed at a CBD diagnostic center mutually agreed upon by the employer and the employer must provide such examinations at no cost to the employee. 1910.1024 L. Medical removal. 1910.1024 L1. An employee is eligible for medical removal if the employee works in a job with airborne exposure at or above the action level, and either 1910.1024 L1 I. The employee provides the employer with 1910.1024 L1 I A through B. A written medical report indicating a confirmed positive finding or CBD diagnosis, or a written medical report recommending removal from airborne exposure to beryllium in accordance with paragraph K5V or K7.3 of this standard, or 1910.1024 L1-2. The employer receives a written medical opinion recommending removal from airborne exposure to beryllium in accordance with paragraph K6V or K7.4 of this standard. 1910.1024 L2. If an employee is eligible for medical removal, the employer must provide the employee with the employee's choice of 1910.1024 L2 I through 2 removal as described in paragraph L3 of this standard, or remaining in a job with airborne exposure at or above the action level, provided that the employer provides and ensures that the employee uses respiratory protection that complies with paragraph G of this standard whenever airborne exposures are at or above the action level. 1910.1024 L3. If the employee chooses removal, 1910.1024 L3 I. If a comparable job is available where airborne exposures to beryllium are below the action level, and the employee is qualified for that job or can be trained within 1 month, the employer must remove the employee to that job. The employer must maintain for 6 months from the time of removal the employee's base earnings, seniority, and other rights and benefits that existed at the time of removal. 1910.1024 L3 2. If comparable work is not available, the employer must maintain the employee's base earnings, seniority, and other rights and benefits that existed at the time of removal for 6 months or until such time that comparable work described in paragraph L3 I becomes available, whichever comes first. 1910.1024 L4. The employer's obligation to provide medical removal protection benefits to a removed employee shall be reduced to the extent that the employee receives compensation for earnings lost during the period of removal from a publicly or employer-funded compensation program, or receives income from another employer made possible by virtue of the employee's removal. 1910.1024 M. Communication of hazards. 1910.1024 M1 General. 1910.1024 M1 I through 1910.1024 M1 3 Chemical manufacturers, importers, distributors, and employers must comply with all requirements of the HCS, Section 1910.1200, for beryllium. In classifying the hazards of beryllium, at least the following hazards must be addressed: cancer, lung effects, CBD and acute beryllium disease, beryllium sensitization, skin sensitization, and skin, eye, and respiratory tract irritation. Employers must include beryllium in the hazard communication program established to comply with the HCS. Employers must ensure that each employee has access to labels on containers of beryllium and to safety data sheets, and is trained in accordance with the requirements of the HCS, Section 1910.1200, and Paragraph M4 of this standard. 1910.1024 M2 Warning signs. 1910.1024 M2 I Posting. The employer must provide and display warning signs at each approach to a regulated area so that each employee is able to read and understand the signs and take necessary protective steps before entering the area. 1910.1024 M2 Sign specification. 1910.1024 M2 The employer must ensure that the warning signs required by paragraph M2 I of this standard are legible and readily visible. 1910.1024 M2 B The employer must ensure each warning sign required by paragraph M2 I of this standard bears the following legend: danger, regulated area, beryllium, may cause cancer, causes damage to lungs, authorized personnel only. Wear respiratory protection and personal protective clothing and equipment in this area. 1910.1024 M3 Warning labels. Consistent with the HCS, Section 1910.1200, the employer must label each immediate container of clothing, equipment, and materials contaminated with beryllium and must, at a minimum, include the following on the label: danger, contains beryllium, may cause cancer, causes damage to lungs, avoid creating dust, do not get on skin. 1910.1024 M4 Employee information and training. 1910.1024 M4 I for each employee who has, or can reasonably be expected to have, airborne exposure to or dermal contact with beryllium. 1910.1024 M4 I through C. The employer must provide information and training in accordance with the HCS, Section 1910.1200 H. The employer must provide initial training to each employee by the time of initial assignment, and the employer must repeat the training required under this standard annually for each employee. 1910.1024 M4 2 The employer must ensure that each employee who is, or can reasonably be expected to be, exposed to airborne beryllium can demonstrate knowledge and understanding of the following: 1910.1024 M4 2A through 1910.1024 M4 2I the health hazards associated with airborne exposure to and dermal contact with beryllium, including the signs and symptoms of CBD. The written exposure control plan, with emphasis on the locations of beryllium work areas, including any regulated areas, and the specific nature of operations that could result in airborne exposure, especially airborne exposure above the TWAPL or SAL. The purpose, proper selection, fitting, proper use, and limitations of personal protective clothing and equipment, including respirators. Applicable emergency procedures. Measures employees can take to protect themselves from airborne exposure to and dermal contact with beryllium, including personal hygiene practices. The purpose and a description of the medical surveillance program required by paragraph K of this standard, including risks and benefits of each test to be offered. The purpose and a description of the medical removal protection provided under paragraph L of this standard. The contents of the standard, and the employee's right of access to records under the Records Access Standard, Section 1910.1020. 1910.1024 M4 3 When a workplace change, such as modification of equipment, tasks, or procedures, results in new or increased airborne exposure that exceeds, or can reasonably be expected to exceed, either the TWAPL or the SAL, The employer must provide additional training to those employees affected by the change in airborne exposure. 1910.1024 M4 Employee Information. The employer must make a copy of this standard and its appendices readily available at no cost to each employee and designated employee representatives. 1910.1024 N. Record keeping. 1910.1024 N1 Air monitoring data. 1910.1024 N1 I. The employer must make and maintain a record of all exposure measurements taken to assess airborne exposure as prescribed in paragraph D of this standard. 1910.1024 N1 2. This record must include at least the following information. 1910.1024 N1 2 A through F. The date of measurement for each sample taken, the task that is being monitored, the sampling and analytical methods used and evidence of their accuracy, the number, duration, and results of samples taken, the type of personal protective clothing and equipment, including respirators, worn by monitored employees at the time of monitoring, and the name and job classification of each employee represented by the monitoring, indicating which employees were actually monitored. 1910.1024 N1 3. The employer must ensure that exposure records are maintained and made available in accordance with the Records Access Standard, Section 1910.1020. 1910.1024 N2 Objective data. 1910.1024 N2 I. Where an employer uses objective data to satisfy the exposure assessment requirements under paragraph D2 of this standard, the employer must make and maintain a record of the objective data relied upon. 1910.1024 N2 2. This record must include at least the following information. 1910.1024 N2 2 A through E. The data relied upon, the beryllium containing material in question, the source of the objective data, a description of the process, task, or activity on which the objective data were based, and other data relevant to the process, task, activity, material, or airborne exposure on which the objective data were based. 1910.1024 N2 3. The employer must ensure that objective data are maintained and made available in accordance with the Records Access Standard, Section 1910.1020. 1910.1024 N3 Medical Surveillance. 1910.1024 N3 I. The employer must make and maintain a record for each employee covered by medical surveillance under paragraph K of this standard. 1910.1024 N3 2. The record must include the following information about each employee. 1910.1024 N3 2 A through 1910.1024 N3 2 C. Name and job classification. A copy of all licensed physicians' written medical opinions for each employee, and a copy of the information provided to the PLHCP as required by paragraph K4 of this standard. 1910.1024 N3 3. The employer must ensure that medical records are maintained and made available in accordance with the Records Access Standard, Section 1910.1020. 1910.1024 N4 Training. 1910.1024 N4 I. At the completion of any training required by this standard, the employer must prepare a record that indicates the name and job classification of each employee trained, the date the training was completed, and the topic of the training. 1910.1024 N4 2. This record must be maintained for 3 years after the completion of training. 1910.1024 N5 Access to records. Upon request, the employer must make all records maintained as a requirement of this standard available for examination and copying to the Assistant Secretary, the Director, each employee, and each employee's designated representatives in accordance with the Records Access Standard, Section 1910.1020. 1910.1024 N6 Transfer of records. The employer must comply with the requirements involving transfer of records set forth in the Records Access Standard, Section 1910.1020. 1910.1024 O. Dates. 1910.1024 01 Effective date. This standard shall become effective March 10, 2017. 1910.1024.02 Compliance Dates. 1910.1024.02 I through ID. Obligations contained in paragraphs C, D, G, K, and L of this standard, March 12, 2018. Change rooms and showers required by paragraph I of this standard, March 11, 2019. Engineering controls required by paragraph F of this standard, March 10, 2020. And all other obligations of this standard, December 12, 2018. 1910.1024 P. Appendix. Table 8.1 in this appendix sets forth the operations that were performed under the circumstances described in the column heading above the particular operations, trigger the requirement for a beryllium work area.